But I was asked to give this talk because I was commenting on the fact that I quite often get asked, is a brain tumour an acquired brain injury? And my answer is yes. By definition, it is a brain injury. And the next question is, do you sort of look at all young people with all acquired brain injuries on the same sort of issues? And my answer to that is a little bit more complicated. Yes, I do. I think about all this breadth of domains and all these different areas of functioning. But I might see different things in different people depending on what type of brain injury they have. So that's what I'm going to talk to you guys about today. And I didn't know that was a video, that picture. I'm quite pleased with that. So you might find a few things like, oh, yes. So just very quickly, a definition of what an acquired brain injury is. It's any damage to the brain that occurs after birth. And I was discussing with some colleagues earlier, actually, that it's very frustrating that birth injuries aren't included because we do see similar things in and around birth injuries as well. So it's not hereditary, congenital, degenerative, or caused by birth trauma. It can be traumatic or non-traumatic, so that can be infections and things like that. And it impacts pretty much everything. And so I kind of try and describe acquired brain injury as an umbrella term, and it includes all of these different conditions, and brain tumour is one of them. So before I go on and talk about this in more detail, I wanted to get you guys a little bit more interactive. So I've got a little test for you that I thought you might enjoy. I'm hoping this is going to work. I've got Sam over there just in case. But
the monkey business illusion. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the ball. The correct answer is 16 passes. Did you spot the gorilla? For people who haven't seen or heard about a video like this before, about half missed the gorilla. If you knew about the gorilla, you probably saw it. But did you notice the curtain changing color or the player on the black team leaving the game? Let's rewind and watch it again. There comes the gorilla, and there goes a player, and the curtain is changing from red to gold. When you're looking for a gorilla, you often miss other unexpected events.
So my point there is our brains are amazing, but we often don't know what's going on inside our own brains. And sometimes we need someone else to have a look and sort of help us work out what's going on. And to me, that's really the role of a neuropsychologist, is to do that and actually see those things and separate them out. And we cover lots of areas, not all of them directly, as I'll say. So first of all, one of the things we'll often do as a neuropsychologist is we will look at cognition and learning. So I've mapped this out in the same way as the EHCP, so that you can kind of see where we would feed into these different categories. And an IQ is just an overall overview of our general abilities and some of our core processing skills. So we'll look at visual and verbal abilities, and I didn't include any of our real materials because I thought some people here might be like, oh, no, I don't want to see that again, because you've probably been through it several times. We'll look at something called working memory, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, and we think about processing speed. Those are just to give us a rough idea of where someone is at and how they're getting on. But when we're looking at these things, we don't expect someone to be at the same level for all of these things. What we often see, and see this very, very much in brain tumour survivors, is what we call a spiky profile. So we see real strengths in one area and weaknesses in another area. And then after we've had a look at IQ and those general abilities, we might look at attention. And people are often surprised. We use attention as this word to cover lots and lots of different things. And things like being able to sustain your focused attention, that is a real skill. But also, you have to be selective in your attention. So I don't know if you can see that picture very easily, but there's a lady sitting there quietly reading her book, not hearing the guy shouting on his phone, the dog barking at her, the stuff going on in the background. Some people find that really easy to do. Some people find that really difficult. And then you have the switching attention very rapidly and what we call multitasking. And I know people talk a lot about men can't multitask and women can, but it's not strictly true. We all have strengths and weaknesses in these areas, different areas of attention. And actually understanding this within our education or our work environments is really, really important, because some kids need to be sat at the front of the class with no distractions. Other kids need stuff going on so that they can stay focused. So we have to understand those individual differences in order to make sure we're making the right recommendations and putting the right things in place. And then I'm going to talk about executive functions. I've noticed a lot of people today have mentioned executive functions. I don't know if everybody knows what they are. I do, because I talk about them all the time, but I thought it would be helpful, and I'm sorry, that's come up a little bit smaller than I thought. I put together this sort of wheel because I thought it was helpful for people to know how many different aspects there are to this umbrella term, executive function. I'm very happy to share this slide if anyone emails me, because you'll be able to see it better on a computer where you can enlarge it. But really, the key thing about executive functions is it's all about regulation. So it's about cognitive regulation. It's about being able to plan and problem solve and do all of those things. It's about emotional regulation. It's about being able to control how we react to things. And it's about behavioural regulation. It's about inhibitory control, being able to stop ourselves. My inhibitory control issue, chocolate. If there was chocolate there, I'd be like, oh, yes, I would find that difficult. And every single person on this planet has a different executive function profile. But if you've had an acquired brain injury or a brain tumour or treatments along those lines, then you will have a spiky profile here. Pretty much guaranteed. But like I say, all of us have a spiky profile in terms of our executive functions. And in fact, I was talking about it over dinner with colleagues last night. Who can start a task but not finish it? Who can finish a task but not get it started? Those kinds of things. We all have those issues. Some of us have time management difficulties, etc., etc. And actually understanding those in the developing brain is really tricky, because these executive function skills are still developing in our 20s. Right up until our late 20s. And so this picture is a moving picture the whole time. And that's why we often say, if you're going to see a neuropsychologist, please get a review. And we often say, can you come back in a few years and we'll see where you're at and if your profile has stayed the same or not. And one of the things we're finding, now, and this links to Paul, who I'm going to catch later, and I'm going to say, talk to me about cognitive fatigue and how that relates to things. And in fact, hot off the press, I probably shouldn't be sharing this, but been working with a student who's been looking at this in young people who have ADHD, who are known to have executive function difficulties. Cognitive fatigue is very strongly associated with those kinds of cognitive difficulties. And so what we know, you're putting in, if you've got any challenges in any of these areas, memory, I haven't talked about memory yet, have I? No. Oh, that's odd. Where's my memory slide gone? Memory should have come earlier. Maybe Sam will be able to find it. I'm pretty sure I sent it. But cognitive fatigue, if you've got any difficulties in memory, attention, executive function, or even general ability, no, it's not on there, Sam. It's disappeared. But I can speak to memory. We just have exhaustion from trying to keep up, because we're trying to do as the world expects us to do, and that may not come quite so easy, and that is very exhausting. So a shrug from the back about memory. Memory is actually another really key area for us as neuropsychologists, and there are 3 key types of memory that I would just like to briefly mention. So I mentioned working memory. That's the ability to hold information in mind and work on it. So it's like someone giving you a phone number and you going off and putting it into your mobile phone, or someone asking you to do mental arithmetic. That is working memory. And that's often assessed with your IQ assessment. And a lot of people then go, oh, well, if that's fine, your memory is fine. Oh, no, no, no. That is a completely different type of memory to long-term memory. And we have different processes. So we have implicit long-term memory, which is things like being able to ride a bike, and things that we might not need conscious awareness for. So, you know, a lot of drivers in the room, I imagine, ever been driving and you go, oh, was that light green or was it red? Because you've gone into automatic. That's an implicit memory. You've learnt that skill. But what we focus a lot on in neuropsychology is explicit long-term memory, where we have the difference between semantic memory and episodic memory. Now, if I asked you guys, what is the capital of France? Hopefully most of you would know that the answer was Paris. If I said to you, when did you learn that? I suspect most people go, oh, I just know it. That's your semantic memory. Whereas if I said, what were you doing last weekend? And you don't need to tell me all the details. That would be an episode. That's a one-off event, and that's your episodic memory. And so with kids, we might ask, what did you learn at school today? And most of them will go, oh, I don't know. But, so, you know, if you press it, they may be able to say, oh, I did a bit of maths and we studied algebra or whatever. That's an episodic memory, but eventually that algebra and that repeated learning will become semantic memory. And it's a really important distinction because a lot of young people with brain tumours, particularly if they've been close to the hippocampus, and I think the craniopharyngiomas, this is a significant issue. It's episodic memory that will be affected, and schools go, oh, what's that? Because it's not something they're used to working with. So memory is quite important, and I feel quite embarrassed that my memory slide was forgotten. But there we are. I'm glad I remembered at some point. So I'm going, why is cognitive fatigue there? Anyway, moving on. So the other area that as a clinical neuropsychologist that we get very involved in is the social, emotional and mental health. And as we talked about before, any brain injury is going to affect you directly in this area and indirectly. So the actual brain injury itself can directly cause anxiety, depression, anger regulation difficulties. But also when you're living with the consequences of a brain injury, all the things we've heard about all day today, you can get secondary anxiety, depression, trauma. And so as neuropsychologists, this is really key to all our thinking because that impacts how we think as well. So we have to sort of include all of that in our thinking as well. And of course, that affects our insight and our awareness. Do we understand what our strengths and weaknesses are? And that affects our identity and who we are. And this is particularly apparent in adolescence as we see this emerging. And a lot of young people are like, oh, but I thought my life was going to be different. Who am I? You know, and it's really important that we understand that this identity is a changing thing and that we are working on that. And I think it was Jill who mentioned that earlier. It's a really key issue. And while we're doing all this work, and in fact, if you see a neuropsychologist, you may be with them for maybe 4 or 5 hours, because to cover all of this is really quite hard. And we do spend a lot of time asking you to do puzzles and quizzes and all these sorts of things to help us work out this picture and get that profile, that spiky profile, and work out what people's strengths and weaknesses are. And while we're doing that in our cognition and learning and our social, emotional and mental health, we're also looking at I don't know why that title comes in so slowly. Communication and interaction. So the whole time we're thinking about that alongside. And what we might pick up on is certain difficulties that someone might be experiencing with their language, with their comprehension, their ability to speak about things. And it's not just about phonics and syntax, it's about that social interaction as well. And if we identify that as being something we have a concern about, we don't assess it in detail. We will refer you to a speech and language therapist. And we'll be thinking about all of these verbal things. But we'll also be thinking about non-verbal communication and interaction and whether someone might be struggling to pick up on some of those cues and those sorts of things. And so we sort of go, oh, they didn't pick up on my facial expression or my gesture or whatever. And again, we would go to speech and language to follow up with that. And I've no idea how I'm doing for time.
Coming up to the end.
Okay, cool. I will be quick. And another area that we monitor is sensory and physical processing. So thinking about sensory processing, we may observe some hyposensitivity or some hypersensitivity. But what we really focus on is the visual processing. And the auditory processing. It was lovely to hear Naomi talking earlier about cerebral visual impairment, because I think that's something that's often missed. And as a neuropsychologist, I'm often shouting, please go and see somebody about the visual processing because it's so impactful. But I would also say the auditory processing is similar, because you can get a lot of misunderstandings and confusion when someone doesn't hear things the way we think they've heard them. We will also very briefly look at motor skills, fine motor skills mostly. Gross motor skills we just tend to observe as people coming in and out, and might refer to OT or physio to explore that in more detail as well. And all of these things lead not just to the cognitive fatigue that I mentioned before, but physical fatigue as well. And these are really important when we're thinking about holistically about someone with a brain injury. And we can't forget, and I mention this because this is in the EHCP as well, that we have to think about the medical health issues that might also be going on for someone. This is particularly relevant for brain tumour survivors, because if you've had an injury, a one-off injury, yes, you may end up with some health complications, but when you've had a brain tumour, there's many of them and they're quite complex. And so we have to think about all of these things. I was very briefly going to say, and this is my almost last slide, similarities and differences between childhood brain tumour and other types of acquired brain injury. What I tend to see is I do see more anxiety and depression in brain tumour survivors. I see a lot more complex trauma, which is this sort of lots of experiences that have been very challenging. Worries about recurrence and what the future holds. Fatigue, absolutely massive issue, and the health issues that tend to be endocrine related and sensory related. So that's where I would tend to be expecting to see differences in the brain tumour group. I briefly had in here a slide about the guidance that is about rehabilitation. It's NICE guideline 252. It's quite useful if you're trying to fight for things and wanting to say this is needed. And then finally, I just wanted to say thank you for your attention and supporting success. And I leave you with one of my favourite quotes from the Dalai Lama, because we can all make a difference. And I think, it's great to see all the people here doing that.